I'd like to introduce Ben Williams. Ben has a BA from Tulane University, Green Wave, and a law degree from William and Mary. He previously was a policy researcher at Princeton University. He's now the program principal of the National Conference of State Legislatures. And one of his duties is to track trends in congressional and state legislative redistricting, which we are going to hear about now. So I'd like to introduce Ben Williams of the NCSL.
Thanks so much, Chad. Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. How's everyone doing today? Am I in a good position for the Zoom camera? All right, well, I'm like, my head's at the top, but that's okay. You know, you get the best part, which is just my microphone. So I'm going to be talking today about redistricting, and I don't see the slide. Yeah, one moment, it's coming. So I'll just go ahead and go through a little bit about NCSL. I know that you've had speakers from the National Conference of State Legislatures speaking here before, so it's not news necessarily who NCSL is, but just to give you a better sense for those of you who might not have seen those past presentations, we are the nation's preeminent organization with a bipartisan structure serving the needs of legislatures and legislative staff. Bipartisan doesn't mean that we are ourselves bipartisan. We are nonpartisan, and the work that we provide and the information that we give to legislators and legislative staffers is nonpartisan, so that they can take that and do with it what they need to do to best serve the needs of their constituents. So that's a little bit about NCSL. So our outline for today is we're going to be talking about redistricting, and redistricting has a lot of different contexts: state, local, national. So there are a lot of layers of which you could analyze it. We only have 15 to 20 minutes for this conversation. So we're going to focus exclusively on redistricting in Colorado. What does that mean for the state? What does it mean for, in particular, the congressional delegation for the state of Colorado? Because that's the only redistricting that has been completed as of now. And we're going to put it in the national context. So what are the, how does Colorado compare to the nation? Is Colorado's system unique or different than other states, peer states maybe in the West? And putting in context who is in the driver's seat nationally in terms of the parties for redistricting going into 2022. So starting off where we were. So if you remember in 2011, the Colorado redistricting system was, there was a commission that was primarily very closely tied to the legislature that drew legislative districts. And then the congressional districts were drawn by the legislature as a normal bill. It would go through the normal legislative process, and it would be subject to the governor's veto. And then the legislature would have the opportunity to override it or reach some compromise. And in the end, it might end up in the courts. Voters in 2018 changed that process with two amendments, amendments Y and Z. I'm sure most of you voted on those. And what those amendments did is they created two separate redistricting commissions. You may hear them referred to as independent commissions in the press. You may yourself refer to them as independent commissions. For purposes of this conversation, I'm just going to call it a commission. So you have the two commissions for legislative and congressional redistricting. What does that really mean? Well, how are they structured? And I promise this is the only slide with a lot of text on it. So we have, on both commissions, they're evenly divided politically. So you have 4 Democratic appointees, 4 Republican appointees, and 4 appointees who are not affiliated with either of the 2 major parties in the state. At least one of the commissioners on both commissions has to come from west of the Continental Divide. And the commissions can change their deadlines in response to extenuating circumstances, which was a very fortuitous thing for the people who wrote these ballot measures to include, because they had no idea that COVID was going to wreak havoc on the redistricting schedule for all states, Colorado included. The maps are drawn by staff. So the legislature actually lends staffers to the commission who have decades of experience in redistricting. And they take their instructions from the commissioners and they draw draft plans. And it's an iterative process. So you'll have multiple iterations of maps before you get to the ultimate final product that's adopted by the state. In terms of the criteria, I think the most interesting thing to know is that these criteria here are actually ranked. So this is a hierarchical order. So as you go down, these have increasingly or decreasing priority. So by the time you get to competitiveness, competitiveness is actually a relatively low criterion on the totem pole compared to something like preserving political subdivisions. That can mean counties or cities or towns. It's up to the commission to decide exactly what that means. So this is the congressional map as it stands today. These are the congressional districts that you've been familiar with for 10 years. I'm going to toggle between this and the new map that was just adopted by the commission so that you can see how they differ. So this is Colorado's new congressional districting map. You can see Boulder would be right around there somewhere. So you're still in the 2nd district. It is now essentially a Northern Front Range district is what it has turned into. The new district, I don't know if you heard Colorado got a new 8th district, is this I-25 Northern corridor. It actually reaches over into Weld County and picks up Greeley. The 6th district, which is Jason Crow, originally wrapped all the way around Denver up towards Broomfield. It now is exclusively an Aurora, Centennial, Littleton district. Denver is still kept mostly whole, and you have 2 massive districts. Obviously, you have the enormous Western Slope district, which swoops all the way down towards Pueblo, and then you have the Eastern Plains district as well. Because Colorado added a new congressional district, all of the districts actually have fewer people in them than they did 10 years ago. That's just the way the math works. And they're all slightly smaller in terms of geography. So if you're looking at the old map and you're thinking these older districts were a lot larger, you'd be correct in thinking that. They have shrunk somewhat. So just a couple of zoom ins for you. This is Denver, of course, and you can see you have the 6th district, you have the Denver district, you have the Jeffco Western Suburban District. Interestingly enough, if you drove from my house in Aurora, which is right around there, to Boulder, under the new plan, I have to drive through 5 different congressional districts to get here, which is just an interesting feat of geography. Just on where the Boulder Turnpike is, you actually do go very briefly through this Jeffco district on your way into the 2nd. And then zooming into Boulder proper, the commission's website actually has not as great resolution when you're zooming into these districts. So I actually put a red circle around where the city of Boulder is. So you can see how that compares. You can see there's this like little finger from the Jeffco district that sort of creeps up to just east of Boulder. Then you have this new district here. And then you have the Eastern Plains district, which does reach down and takes Loveland, which is cut off from the rest of the Front Range. So you might be asking, how does this district perform? How do you know its political outcomes? And there are a lot of different organizations that rate or score congressional districting plans and legislative redistricting plans. I've given you one example that came up fairly quickly, which was from my former employer, Princeton University. This is a product that I was actually working on before I came over to NCSL. But this is a report card that is supposed to show based on the criteria that the state follows. So if it prioritizes competitiveness, that gets higher priority in the formula. If it prioritizes keeping counties together, that gets higher priority in the formula. What is the overall score? And overall, Princeton gave the Colorado Congressional Commission final plan an A. An A doesn't mean perfect, but an A means better than other plans that could have been selected. And if you see it gets a C for competitiveness, that's because there's only one true competitive district. That's the new 8th district. And it gets a C for geographic features. You'll notice if you're looking through other state scores, and I encourage you all to go to this website, by the way, if you get the chance to look at other states or to look at the legislative districts once they are finalized by the Legislative Commission. Competitiveness and geographic features tend to be a trade-off. If you're going to follow cities and counties, because of the way that Americans naturally sort themselves into living in certain areas, you tend to find that the more you follow a geographic feature, keeping all cities and counties whole, the lower your competitiveness score goes. You have to break up a lot of cities and counties and join people together who may not have much in common in order to force districts that are close to 50-50 politically. So that's Colorado's congressional districts. The legislative districts will be coming out this week, and I'm happy to answer any questions later if you all have questions about how those turned out relative to how they may have turned out under old systems or previous expectations. But putting Colorado in the national context, How do states redistrict their state legislatures? So you have this map here. It's a lot of colors. I understand that. This is the color that Colorado is. It's this green, that's commission only. You have a few states in this yellowish color. Those are states where the legislature has the first assignment, but there's some deadline in the law. If they don't redistrict by a certain time, the task shifts to a backup commission. There are a couple of states where this always happens, where they never succeed. Connecticut is one. Connecticut, I don't think, has ever not gone to their backup commission in the past 50 years. They're just a perennially miss their deadline. And then there are several states with what are called advisory commissions. And the best way to think of an advisory commission is it's just advice. The legislature can take the advice of the advisory commission, or they cannot take the advice of the advisory commission and do what the legislature thinks is the correct choice. And so those states are Utah and New Mexico are the two newest additions to that list. The states that you see in the steely gray bluish color, those are the states that have done it the way that the founders originally said it in the US Constitution, which is this was a task assigned to the legislatures of the states themselves. And that's still the case in 23 states. When you look at Congress, you can see that there are actually more states that have legislative only. There would be even more if these states didn't have at-large congressional seats. But you have these seats with advisory commissions. Once again, you see Utah and New Mexico show up. Colorado also uses a commission for congressional, as you are aware. And one thing that I think is interesting to note is that the commission trend has been a Western trend. You probably noticed that with these two maps. There tends to be a lot more of the green color out west. There's a little cluster here in the mid-Atlantic, Midwest on the legislative side, but not so much on the congressional side. So when we at NCSL go into the states and we talk about it, we talk about commissions as a Western phenomenon more than anything else. So all of that being said, who's really in control going into 2022? And the answer is the Republican Party. The Republican Party controls 20 state delegations for congressional districts. And you can see those are all the states in this orange color. There are 9 states where the Democrats do control. And there are 6 states where there is split control. And split control either means one chamber of the legislature is controlled by one party, another chamber of the legislature is controlled by the other party, or there's a split between the legislature and the governor. And so you see that as most common in the upper Midwest. This is competitive states you're always thinking about: Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Those are the states where you tend to have divided control. Michigan actually has a new commission this decade. This is the first time they're ever going to be redrawing districts. If they didn't have a commission, they would also be split control. So Republicans have an edge, but I don't think it's as helpful to think about the edge. It's important to think about marginal advantage over the last decade. Because if you think about it, if you are a state that redistricted and you was single party control last decade and you took the advantage to a 10 and you drew as many districts that were favorable to you as possible and you control redistricting again, that's not necessarily the case that you're going to be able to eke out more advantage 10 years later. You may be able to eke out some, but not as much. And Republicans' edge was higher in 2010 than it is today. It decreased by about 50 seats. That was pretty much evenly distributed among the states that flipped to Democratic control, the states that have split control, and the states that have recently adopted commissions. So when you hear people say, oh, Republicans are dominating redistricting, that is technically true. But the Republicans do not have as strong an edge as they did 10 years ago. It has fallen off somewhat. And there's another take that you can do, just one step further into the analysis, which goes to show you that a lot of the states that Republicans control, they controlled last cycle as well. In fact, there's only a handful of states that Republicans have recently gotten control of. So overall, the Republican Party is in good shape, not as in good shape as they were 10 years ago. And the Democratic Party is in better shape than they were 10 years ago. But I mean, you can see the difference in these numbers. It is still by far a Republican advantage nationwide. So to close, why should you care about redistricting? This is very detailed. There's a lot of math involved. Most people have other interests that they really care about: healthcare, transportation issues that may be relevant to you, environmental issues. And it's because redistricting is critical to all of those. There was a friend of mine who lived in Virginia when I was first getting my start in this. And what he would always say at his public meetings was redistricting is not the issue you have to care about most. It's the issue you have to care about first. If there's some policy interest that you have as a citizen, as a member of society, that you want to go talk to your legislature and you want to see advanced, the makeup of the legislature is really important to understanding whether or not your push will be successful or not. And the number one determinant of who will control the legislature for 10 years, who will control Congress for 10 years, is redistricting. More than any dollar you give to a campaign, more than anything else that is done nationwide, redistricting shapes the makeup of legislative bodies more than anything else. So if you have something that you really care about, this is the time to be talking to elected officials who may be in control of redistricting, or talking to the Legislative Commission. They have not finished their job yet. If you would like to go look at their draft maps and would like to provide feedback, I think that ends today. So today would be your last chance to go and express your opinion. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions you have, and thanks so much for having me.
Well, first of all, thank you. It was really wonderful to have this presentation. You know, ever since Elbridge Gerry, the governor of Massachusetts in 1816, drew the silly salamander-shaped district, we've had this nonsense. I would like to propose something. It might not be politically correct, but I mean politically possible, but that you could use it. And it is this: have a computer. You have nonpartisan computer people, some Republicans, some Democrats, to develop a program that says you put in the number of people all over the place, and without regard to race, color, creed, or what have you, and then you have the computer draw up districts of equal, as nearly equal possible as representation, and say you can't have more than 2 odd-shaped sizes of the 4. Maybe one would be a river and the other something else. Why? And then there must be 2 straight line sides as the shape of your district. Why couldn't you do something like that?
So
logically, forget the political opposition.
Well, sir, I will tell you, you're in good company. There are a lot of people who have proposed a system like that. I will give you the rebuttal that is commonly given. So as an attorney, this is what I love. Rebuttals are just fantastic. So the rebuttal that is typically given is by people who are advocates for what are known as communities of interest. You may have heard this term before. It doesn't really have a firm definition by design. But the idea of a community of interest is that it's some group of people who share some interest. The community of interest for Boulder may be the city of Boulder. Maybe people who live in Boulder have a connection that people who live outside Boulder don't have with people who live in Boulder. It could be people within a particular watershed. It could be people who all work at the factory in some town in the Midwest. You can imagine a lot of different definitions of communities of interest. Computers aren't really good at identifying those. It requires some manual input. And that is something that's difficult. It's also difficult for a computer to draw a map that complies with the Voting Rights Act. So identifying areas of districts that could have an opportunity to elect a protected minority group's candidate of choice, that can be difficult sometimes. I personally think that as computer technology advances and we get into things like quantum computing, where computers are thinking at a higher level than people are, there may be a point where it really makes sense to hand the task over to a computer. And the legislature could easily give it to a computer and then say, oh, don't sue us, we didn't draw it, the computer did. That seems like something that is very feasible. But at this point, I think the consensus is that these commissions are the best solution for now. If you're concerned about the drawing districts for partisan advantage, because you cannot necessarily take into account all of the legal and preferred factors that go into redistricting with a computer algorithm.
So I saw you showed us several different methods by which the decisions are made.
Yes.
And you referenced the Princeton project that you worked at on gerrymandering, and I'm curious, you showed us the grade for Colorado. one might hypothesize that the commission-based methodology yields the highest grades, but I'm curious what you've actually found when you look at it across the states. What is sort of the methodology that is most likely to create a high grade of lower partisanship, and what tends to create the most or lowest grades?
Well, you're certainly correct that there could be some confirmation bias and drawing and creating a rubric that naturally favors a particular group's favored system. I certainly talked about commissions when I worked at my old job. My role has changed now that I've gone to NCSL. I no longer advocate. But there are states that have passed maps that get high scores through the legislative process. Maine is a legislative state. They have an advisory commission, but the legislature has the final say. The maps have to be signed by the governor. They've completed their redistricting process. That map got a high score, according to this rubric. So it's not impossible, but you're correct that there are decisions in the design of the test that certainly have an outcome, and by putting partisan fairness, which is a very amorphous term, it can be defined a lot of different ways, into the rubric, can be a problem, which is one of the reasons why when I was at Princeton, I actually decided that this was an impossible task and they shouldn't do it. Clearly when I left, they changed their mind. I hope that that answers your question. I will say that we're relatively early in the process. We don't have a ton of states yet to compare against, but by December, we should have a broad selection of states and scores, and we'll know that which type of method scored better.
We have a question online.
Yes.
Mike Simpson has a question for you.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether there's really any hope for a fair representation without some form of proportional representation. So even like the Germans do, where they elect half their legislature of direct representatives and the other half balances the number to equal the proportion of the vote. Has there really ever been any serious thought about PR in the U.S.?
So thank you, sir, for the question. There is a bill in Congress called the Fair Representation Act that would enact a style of proportional representation. It's not the same style that's used in the Bundestag, the German parliament, but it is a style of proportional representation where you have larger congressional districts that each are multi-member, so they elect multiple different members, and then they use ranked choice voting in those elections. And if you game out the math, it does work out that you do get something closer to national proportional representation under that system than you do under the first past the post single member district system that we currently have. But I haven't seen a lot of, I'm not a political scientist. I tend to rely on the political scientists when I'm trying to understand the math of a particular outcome. And I haven't read a lot of research on the best method of achieving proportional representation. I will say that proportional systems are not that common in the Anglosphere. There are multi-party systems in other Anglo-speaking countries like Canada and the United Kingdom, but they're parliamentary. They're not our system, and there are structural reasons for why it's been two parties in the United States for quite some time. There are changes you can make on the margins that might increase the possibility that a third party could come up, or you might get results that more closely reflect the two-party vote share in a statewide elected body. But as far as I can tell, there hasn't been a huge push for that as of yet. I can talk about that all day, though. We can talk about that as long as you want. Yes, sir.
Professor, could you give us the definition of gerrymandering? Because generally it has a negative connotation.
Sure. So I think that gerrymandering, as people understand it, means drawing districts to achieve a specific political outcome. I think that's the shortest, sweetest definition. There are other kinds of gerrymandering that you may have heard of. There's something called racial gerrymandering. These are legal terms of art. Racial gerrymandering is the same thing, but in terms of the outcome is race, not partisanship. I think the broadest definition is redistricting always has a policy outcome, whatever it is. You're making some conscious decision to keep cities and towns together, you're making a conscious decision to advance the interests of a particular party, you're making a conscious decision to do something when you're redistricting. And people use the phrase gerrymandering when they don't like whatever that is. I can promise you, there are some states where if one party thought that they had an advantage but they gave it over to a commission, they would say the commission was gerrymandering because it wasn't favoring the majority party enough. That does happen in states around the country. So I would say that redistricting is always in the eye of the beholder, and terms like gerrymandering certainly evoke an image in people's minds, and it's very helpful in terms of raising awareness of a particular issue for people who are trying to raise awareness of the issue. But like everything in redistricting and election policy, you quickly get into the gray the further down you dig.
We have another question online with Merrill.
Oh, thank you. Are you hearing me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Thanks for speaking to our club. My question concerns the Supreme Court review of voter restrictions and gerrymandering. And I was got it in a radio program that actually focused in on what was going on in the Supreme Court and the questions were asked. And essentially, one side was saying that even though the intent wasn't to discriminate, that was the result. Mm-hmm. The other side had an interesting argument that I'm posing to you. And their lawyer basically said, we did not have intent to discriminate, but politics is a zero-sum game. Mm-hmm. And we have every right to gerrymander, to voter restrictions, to control, because that's what politics is about, and it's not forbidden in the Constitution. And I wonder what your response is to that argument.
I would say that that is a correct interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. It does not prohibit redistricting for partisan considerations. There are plenty of state constitutions that have prohibitions on redistricting for partisan considerations, Colorado being one of them. But in general, the answer is that the federal Constitution does not have an express written phrase that says you may not redistrict for partisan reasons. Now, there are plenty of rights under substantive due process that have been read into the U.S. Constitution over time. This was one that the Supreme Court decided not to read into it. With the current makeup of the justices and their voting history, I wouldn't anticipate that to change anytime soon. There are a couple of justices we have not seen a lot of information on with this yet. I haven't seen a lot of voting history with Amy Coney Barrett. I haven't seen a lot of voting history with Brett Kavanaugh on either of these issues. So I will not say that things never change. I will also say that when you have justices who are on the Supreme Court for decades and decades and decades, their views tend to evolve over time. So you shouldn't presume that anything that is as it exists right now is static forever. But in the short to medium term, there seems to be a pretty solid majority on the Supreme Court for not reversing their decision in the 2019 case you're referencing that said that partisan gerrymandering was an issue that could not be decided in federal courts. And I wouldn't anticipate that to change in the near future.
Taking this a completely different slant on this, the people who do the redistricting, mm-hmm. How are they paid? And is that a full-time job or just when it comes out, when we have every 10th year when we have complete census?
Sure, so I would say, sir, that it depends on state to state. So in Colorado, for example, there are legislative staffers who are experts in redistricting policy. They have other policy areas that they cover as well. So you can imagine in years 2 through 8, they might be doing transportation or they might be doing some other issue. But they're in the Legislative Services Office. They will shift over to the commission and then handle the build up to redistricting, making sure the commissioners are selected, that they have office space, that the work on the ground is ready, and then they actually draw the lines. And then once they're approved by the Supreme Court, which might take a few trips to the state Supreme Court to get them approved, they'll revert back to their role with the legislature. So that's one way that it's done. There are political consultants that do redistricting work, and they do other kinds of work as well. They might do campaigns or they might do data analytics, but they might add on redistricting as well. And these are not necessarily the people that you're thinking of who are in some smoke-filled room. They advertise. Like, they want you to know who they are. Like, they are very eager to attract more business. And those folks work with a variety of people, and it's not necessarily D's and R's like you would think. I was just in Rhode Island last week, and I was speaking at an event with a Republican attorney who was assisting a Democratic state in their redistricting. And there is a Republican attorney who I know is working with the Michigan Independent Redistricting Commission on advising their line drawer on whether or not the changes that they're making are permissible. So there's a lot of, it's a small sphere of people, to be certain, who specialize in doing this. I am not a line drawer, so I do not do that. I study the policy and I understand the laws as they exist nationwide, and then I produce resources on that for legislators and legislative staffers. But in general, the people who do this have some other gig to pay the bills in years 3 through 7, because otherwise they'd have to earn a lot of, it'd be like a bear in hibernation. You'd have to earn a lot of money now, be very hungry for several years to make it through.
Hi. I've seen some of the technology that's used to do the line drawing, as you said, and it's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
As that technology's evolved, because now we can do it, we can see down at the street level, the amount of transparency and visibility that the people drawing the lines has obviously increased. Has that exacerbated some of the problems with gerrymandering, because you can be a lot more deliberate about it because of the amount of information you have on voter registration, racial disparate populations, that sort of thing? Or is technology going to help solve the problem?
Sure. So thank you, sir. I will say that precision certainly makes it easier to achieve desired outcomes. I think that's generally true across the board. If your desired outcome is partisan advantage, then having precision over having a lack of precision is certainly something you would prefer. I think, though, if you ask political scientists, one of the things that they would tell you is that it's not just the software itself, it's also the sorting of people. If you look back to like the early days of the Reagan administration, people were not as sorted into liberals were in the Democratic Party and conservatives were in the Republican Party. You had an entire wing of conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. And there was a lot more amorphous, and there was a lot more split ticket voting. You couldn't necessarily predict how a voter would vote, or as they would say in redistricting, perform in a certain map, because you wouldn't know what the actual outcome was going to be. As people have sorted themselves over time into thinking in more consistent ways ideologically, and they've sorted themselves into party, you can look at things like voter history, party identification. Those are more predictive of outcomes than they might have been 20 or 30 years ago. The software certainly plays a role. I don't know if it's the most important role. I think that the nation itself has changed, and that is reflected in the results as well.
As someone who worked for the same organization as Ben for 42 years, I've been watching redistricting for a long time, and I'd just like to add a couple of comments to what you said. One is in response to Dick's question about how people are paid. Nancy Billica and I were both applicants to be on these redistricting commissions. We didn't make it, but I can tell you that the members of the commission, who basically work from April through about now, April through October, are paid $200 a day whenever they're working on that. The other thing I'd add in response to the question about why not let computers draw it, well, that's what happens. Computers do draw the districts, but people are giving them various criteria. And and the computers can draw any number of districts that meet the kinds of criteria that were suggested in the question. The hard thing is the communities of interest. And the commissions here in Colorado struggled with that. And that was part of what divided them. How important is it that X, Y, and Z communities be in the same district? And then the last comment I'd make, just as a Boulder County person who's recently moved from Boulder to Longmont, I gotta say that I'm a lot happier with the new district that has Longmont in the 2nd Congressional District rather than out there on the plains as it did before. So thanks, Ben, for all your contributions today.
Oh, thank you, Carl.
Any more questions? No. All right, I'm going to give it to you now. Thank you.
Ben, I as a member of this club, want to thank you for bringing your super interesting and compelling presentation. Why should I care about this? well, I have to admit I am a bit of a political junkie, but I would say that there are more important reasons. For sure, redistricting is about issues of fairness and representation, and we know that that's a very difficult process. And in that light, you know, if you put the politics aside, it really does conform quite nicely with what Rotary is about. Are these district lines fair to all concerned? And beyond that, of course, the implications for making fair policy and so on. The district lines matter. So as we all know, it's not easy. It's been a very contentious process. Thanks for enlightening us, sharing your wisdom, your experience, your knowledge, and really appreciate that. Now I'd like to share something with you. For well over 30 years, Rotary International has made the global eradication of polio a major commitment. Over that time, polio cases have declined by more than 99.9% worldwide. We are, as we like to remind ourselves, that close to achieving this goal. As a token of our gratitude, in your honor, the Boulder Rotary Club is pleased to contribute 100 doses of vaccine to the Polio Plus Fund. We are so pleased to bring you in as part of this effort.
Well, thank you
so
much.
Thank you.
Yeah, what an honor.
Thank you, Ben, for a great talk. I wish high school government had been that entertaining.